going to start off here with having John make a few comments, and then Bart, and then Steve. And I see probably a few things are starting to come in on Slido already. That's great. We want to make this very interactive. So I'll turn it over to you, John, and have you kick us off, and then we'll go into some Q&A with not only the three of you, but with Seth.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Sarah, this is one of my favorite conferences of the year here in Kansas City, and then the one that we do in Washington, D.C. So I'm always happy to be with this group. Matter of fact, we should probably have this conference more often because there are a lot of friends in the room. It's nice to see everybody and mingle in the hallway. But, you know, there's not a lot I can really add to everything that we've heard today. I mean, Seth texted me last night and he said, "What are you going to talk about today?" And then I see it all on the slides.
Steal it. Yep.
No, but I think there are a couple things I added a little bit extra color to. Seth mentioned crop cash receipts are the lowest that we've seen since, 2007, I believe. Yeah. It's also the largest 3-year decline that we've ever seen in history. Crop cash receipts are down $71 billion from 3 years ago. So that's a substantial decline in crop farm margins. I was down in Texas yesterday with some very large, very successful farmers, and they said, you know, we're just burning through working capital. And we saw today the president said we may use tariff revenue to make some sort of trade aid payment. And they asked the farmers yesterday, well, what are you going to do with that money? And every single one of them said, I'm going to use that to boost my working capital back up. The second observation I'll make is the input cost environment that we're in today is so different than the last time we were in a similar situation in the farm economy. If we didn't have the inflationary pressure that we saw starting in 2021, the crop prices that Seth showed would be above break even for a lot of folks. So the input cost environment is very, very tricky. The third thing is, you know, Congress responded to the tight margin environment that we're in with the American Relief Act and with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. But the challenge is, especially for OBA, the increased reference prices, and we've heard a number of times, it's not going to hit the farm until October of next year. And everybody in this room that reads Agri-Pulse knows that also is going to hit the farm after midterms. So I think that's where some of the pressure to do something now for farmers is coming from. I think the third thing, or the fourth thing I'll add and then turn it back over is everybody's focused on what's happening to the soybeans, obviously. But this is a bigger issue than just what's happening in the soybean market. Cotton prices have really taken a beating the last few years. We've got producers in California who, Chris Clayton was just up in Canada. There's no U.S. wine on the shelves in Canada, no spirits on the shelves in Canada. So wine exports are down 96%. What does that do to land values in California? What does that do to vineyards in California? Tree nuts are having a particularly tough time with tight margin environments too. So it's more than a Midwest issue. We've got challenges across the entire farm economy. But I am optimistic. I think what we heard from the Secretary this morning, I think we're going to turn the corner on this. I'm very confident that these trade deals are going to materialize. The regulatory rollbacks that she's talking about, I think, will benefit farmers and ranchers. And I'm always very bullish on agriculture, and I am still today.
Thanks for kicking us off with that, John. Bart?
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for the invite to be here today. It's great to be with everyone. I've been participating for the last couple of years and attending, but it's great to have the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I'll say the last year has been it's been an interesting one to say the least. It's been an interesting one for me too, having sort of a bird's eye view of what has gone on in the Trump administration. I don't know if Clip is still in the room, but had the good fortune of serving on a very small team with Brian Klippenstein over there on the transition for President Trump at USDA, small but mighty team. And what a great American, great Missourian over there was. That's probably one of the highlights of my 3 months of serving in that role, was getting to serve alongside Clip, and so appreciated getting to work with him. There's obviously been a lot going on. A lot of it's been covered. I've got 5 things I was going to touch on, and I'll try to do it even more briefly now that a lot of it is kind of out there at the moment. The first of those is just echoing the same story on the farm economy. My angle on that is that at AFPC, The work we do for Congress, the work we do for USDA and for the White House is largely around the representative farms that we have, 92 of those in 30 different states and 64 crop farms. If you were to ask us back in March what that outlook looked like, we would have told you that it was the worst outlook for our crop farms, row crop farms, in the 40-year history of our center. I think one bit of good news is because of things that the tax panel, Paul in particular, talked about the investments, Seth alluded to them as well. The outlook now, and my guys just sent the update last night. They've been working, I've been out of the country, they've been working on it, sent it last night, and it does look better than it did in the spring. The problem is it doesn't look good enough, right? It's still a brutal outlook. Maybe just not quite as brutal as it was back in March before those investments. And it naturally raises the question, I get it from policymakers all the time, of with all of this money, with all of these infusions, how can we still be in this spot? Which really brings me to my second point. On that very point, we published on this an article a couple of weeks ago on Southern Ag Today, looking at this one in particular. And it does, and Seth alluded to this too, right? Is this a fundamental economic problem? Is it a cash flow problem? I think in a lot of respects, it's a cash flow problem. It's a cash flow plus problem at the moment. One, if you look at what the American Relief Act did in December, right, the $30.78 billion infusion, $10 billion of that was in economic relief delivered via ECAP early on in the second month of the secretary was on the job. The challenge with that, and you think, well, that's $10 billion. How could growers still be upset? One, it was on 2024 losses. The top line number was $36 billion. In losses. Congress chose to cover 26% of that loss. So you talk about eating into working capital. It had already started. It really ramped up in earnest there. So only covering 26% of the loss last year. And then you think, okay, well, Congress invested 60 plus billion in whatever we're calling OBA, OB3, via improvements to ARC, PLC, and a small investment in crop insurance as well, particularly on the area-wides and on the individual premium subsidy increase. And a lot has been made, but that doesn't kick in till next year, till October of next year by design. And Congress is considering accelerating the payment. We're getting lots of questions about that, but it's more fundamental than that. If you look, even with those improvements, and they were largely 10 to 20% increases in reference prices, but what all have we been talking about in terms of increases in cost of production over the last 4 years alone, 30% plus. And so OB3, while important, while a major commitment for Congress to make and the biggest since 2002, it still didn't, to just be very candid, it still didn't meet the moment in terms of what growers are faced with. And so if you look at the exposure, last year on economic aid, it was $36 billion, it's now about $46 billion, right? You've got a lot of exposure, and if you look at the exposure that exists, OB3 is going to cover between 25 and 75% of the loss. For most growers, it's only covering about 25 to 50% of the loss. So there's still tons. It's not just cash flow. Even if we get to next October, there's still going to be hemorrhaging. And so it leads me to my third point, which is what's going to be done about it. You all heard in the meeting, assuming you've been seeing the notices hitting your phone, in the meeting with the Turkish president a couple hours ago, the president alluded to doing another round of MFP type program using tariff revenue. Certainly there's no time frame or details with that, so to me it wasn't much news. The Secretary, the President have been saying that they're going to help growers, right? So the devil is going to be in the details, but what can be done, right? My first question is back to Congress, right? What can Congress do? Because honestly, they control the purse strings, right? Constitutionally, they control the purse strings. So what Congress should do, that's up to you all to lobby and for Congress to decide. We just advise on implications, right? One of the things they could do is another round of ECAP, right? ECAP 2.0. Right? I noted a few minutes ago, losses are going from roughly 36 to 46 billion this year, right? So it would ECAP 2.0 would likely need to be a little bit bigger. We could also do an MFP 3.0 out of the administration. How do you pay for that? There's been a lot of talk about the CCC. There's not much money left there, right? I don't underestimate USDA attorneys and their ability to find authority for a president to be able to do what he wants when he wants. And so I wouldn't rule that out. But honestly, Congress has a lot to say too, right, about the plus up and the fact that we are still at 1987 levels on the borrowing authority, which just boggles my mind. And one other quick word then on Section 32. A lot of it has been made about Section 32. One note to add. Paul made a very, or I guess it was Harrison that made the point about 30% of customs duties are reserved for USDA use. And customs duties unquestionably are up under the Trump administration, went sideways as tariffs were maintained under the previous administration. But there's revenue there, but it's sort of spoken for. And one thing to keep in mind is it's not just spoken for in terms of the cascade about how it flows to USDA. The appropriators also speak to it. Right now in statute, Section 714 in the appropriations bill says that that USDA cannot use more than $350 million of Section 32 funds for Clause 3 purposes, which is restoring farmers' purchasing parity through direct payments to growers. So Congress has said you can't use Section 32 for those purposes, right? And so again, I keep pointing back to Congress, whether it's restoring, plussing up CCC, whether it's taking the shackles off Section 32, there is a tremendous amount that could be done there, but honestly, I think Congress has a big role to play in that. And to round out mine, a couple of other quick things on tariffs. Obviously, we're all talking about it. A lot of the comments have been focused understandably on soybeans. I would just note it's not just soybeans, it's really across the board. Everyone in the row crop space is feeling the pressure and needing solutions. But I come back to, I served for multiple years when I was in the House as the trade advisor to the members and to the chairman through USMCA, through the first trade war with China. And one of the things invariably, every ag group who came through talked to us about unfair trade practices in the rest of the world. And in theory, in theory, WTO is a great place to address those, but it's essentially defunct at the moment. What other levers do we have, right? I mean, we've written a number of reports on India, what they do alone on minimum support prices and how that hammers wheat growers in the United States. What about China in 2015? 3 crops, rice, corn, and wheat. They exceeded their de minimis spending in the WTO, illegal spending by $100 billion in 1 year, right? And so you had in the first Trump administration a lot done, phase 1, to move the needle with China, to have actual trade enforcement. Over the last 4 years, I don't see much of any evidence that anything happened in the trade space other than really moving sideways. And so we come into this administration with still not a lot to speak for in terms of holding other countries accountable. Is it fun for ag? Not for a minute. But what's the alternative? I really do. I genuinely ask, what is the alternative there? And so I for one think there's wisdom in what the president's doing. I know it's bumpy, particularly in the near term, particularly for soybean, cotton, and sorghum producers. The last thing I will mention then is on competition. It is one that I get asked about by growers and hear comments from growers about all the time. Consolidation in ag, market power in ag. And I realize we're at an agribusiness event, and that may make some people uncomfortable. It should. Because that topic, particularly on the GOP side of the aisle, has sort of been a third rail topic that you don't really deal with it. But farmers are talking about it a lot, that they're at the bottom of the totem pole and everything flows down to them and there's not much left for them when all is said and done. And I hear it everywhere I go. And one of the interesting side notes on MAHA is that part of what is ushering in MAHA, it's broader than just MAHA, right? It's this populist streak in the country that is sort of taking a foothold, and MAHA is the example. There are other examples of that. Another one, a very strong example, is on the competition side, right? And so I suspect, and you're going to see it, you heard some comments from the secretary, you're going to start hearing a lot more from conservative members as well. And so I just say it as a cautionary tale that I think more of that is coming. And we'll have a debate about whether it's demand driven, that we're just, we have these infusions, it drives up demand, or is it a result of concentration? But we've infused $130 billion into the farm economy ad hoc over the last 8 years. I think it's hard to deny it has an inflationary effect, even in agriculture, which to me, one of the solutions is let's get back to standing farm policy and break the chain of ad hoc, but knowing that where we're at right now, we don't have that luxury. It's about surviving to the next year. And so with that, I'll stop, and thanks again, Sarah, for having me.
Thanks for unpacking a lot there, Bart. And I also appreciate, Bart just flew in from overseas. When I first called him, he said, let me see if I can change my flight. I had no idea he was flying back from Europe so he could be here, so thank you. Steve, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here back in Kansas City. Also, go Cyclones. So As the panel has, as many other people have today, have talked a lot about the things that we're going to talk about, and let me just bring a couple things up that may be a little different from what we're seeing. So one thing that I've talked about from the standpoint of prices and what's happening, people and obviously very upset, very concerned, and we're all concerned about where the farmer is today. But this is a supply issue problem, not a demand issue problem. We have tremendous demand for, whether it's here in the United States or globally, for grains and oilseeds. And so you go, okay, well that's great, but then it's the supply side. And one of the things that in the work that the World Board's done is really great to look at the maps and see what's happened, but you don't see a geography in the world today, and we've been worrying about this as a team for the last 3 or 4 years. When does everyone hits on 8 cylinders and produces a full crop? Brazil's had a great crop. We've had a great crop. Australia's got another big crop again this year. Europe came back and had a big wheat crop. Russia has a big wheat crop. So you have everybody producing more than enough than what we need. So that's one thing that's really changed, I think, this year that's really made this a lot more tough. We also get a lot of questions about biofuels, and I won't go into whole detail because we've done a lot of that, but we keep saying, well, what everyone said as this administration came in, what about biofuels? And I've always said to them, biofuels are not going to go away because we need it. Both agriculture needs it and the country needs it from a standpoint when you look at ethanol and its impact on gasoline, because we don't have another oxygenate, for example. But at the same time, I don't think biofuels, they're just not going to have the tailwind they've had over the last decade or more. And so it's important that we recognize that, understand that, and make sure that we have all the pieces in place to make sure that biofuel stays in place, particularly now when we need good crops. A couple things from producers that we're seeing on our side. We've had interesting, and Bart sort of alluded to it, and I absolutely agree. And when we talk about the tariffs, and we've had that question for the last 12 months, everyone's worried about the export side. Rightfully so, and certainly soybeans. But now farmers are recognizing, as we have as well, farmers said, I'm worried about the exports, but I'm really worried about the imports, because 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, what that's done to the machinery costs. They're thinking about active chemical or active ingredients for chemistry and also fertilizer. So that's raised the cost, and that's the part we haven't got down. We haven't seen input costs come down. And I think that's something to really think about. And I can tell you, one of our farm input customers said to me back in April, he was already seeing on the bottom line of their invoices for chemistry, tariffs on that already back in April. And finally, just a couple things, and this just happened over the last month. So credit and risk, is for those of you who are financial people know that credit and risk, you kind of, as bankers, you kind of wonder, do they always run the bank? And you get sort of frustrated with that. But we went through a fairly rigorous review of our grain oilseed clients. The good news is that they were all in pretty decent shape. We didn't see any balance sheets that are in horrible shape. But the interesting thing was that those balance sheets looks better than they did a year ago. And so I bring a little kernel of hope that maybe things are looking a little better. I know that's, I'm not trying to be, happy news, but the reality was we're seeing just a little bit better in their balance sheets this year. So hopefully that, and with all the influx of money coming from the federal government, that will certainly be important to the balance sheets of the farmers. And we remember very clearly back in the first, right before, I guess it would have been about 17, 18 MFP payments, and we saw balance sheets really get much healthier. And so this will certainly help farmers to the point of building working capital. Is really important to see those balance sheets get revitalized a little bit with this money coming in. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Sarah.
All right, thanks. Seth, any kind of react or additions that you'd want to add to our current discussion?
Nothing beyond my I love this panel. This is great. I'm happy to be their opening act. Great comments.
Well, let's dive into not only the questions online, but I just wanted to start with something you referenced about what are the appropriate policy levers, or maybe we should also highlight what are the worst policy levers that someone could select right now and try to move forward. Especially, John and Bart, you've worked on the committee staffs. You see a lot of different ideas that surface during difficult times. And I'm sure you've seen a wide variety of things where you've had to talk people out of them and maybe turn them in some new directions. But if you could have the power to make recommendations right now about maybe a couple of really good directional things on the policy front that would most help growers right now? And then secondarily, what would be one or two things that we should avoid at all costs?
You want to go first, John?
I'm always getting picked on having to go first. Well, I think we all breathed a collective sigh of relief this morning that we're not making direct payments to cattle producers.
The heifer bonus is gone.
I think, and I've had the opportunity the last month to visit with the White House on a number of occasions. I mean, they're trying to figure out what to do. And I think they're looking in the toolbox. We heard tariff revenues as one source. Bart mentioned the CCC. I think they're trying to figure out what tools they have available to them. I don't think they know at this point how much money they would even need. What crops do you need to make payments for? So I think we're still in an information gathering mode in terms of what's the right policy lever to move at this point.
And I would just add to that, if you take kind of the two prevailing policy instruments right now that folks are looking at, ECAP and MFP. On the ECAP side, I think there was a wisdom to what the appropriators did. It's very simple. It's straightforward. You're not capturing you're capturing the average, right? You're not capturing all of the dynamic. But the beauty in that is that if you're trying to get liquidity into the countryside, you can do it very quickly with an instrument like that. And so to me, there's a wisdom in doing that. I think there were a few things that fell through the cracks with that in terms of specific crops, but it's not a bad instrument to do it. On the MFP side, and I will say that, a credit to Seth, which I think, we're all very fortunate that Seth is in and has been in the role that he is, a steady hand at USDA during all of the transition. And one of the questions I asked Seth early on was on MFP. If we were to have to go down this road again, were there lessons learned? Things that could be done different. And I think, to Seth's credit, was already way ahead of that conversation. And thinking back, what are the things that went well with MFP 1 and 2, and things that didn't go well? A penny a bushel for corn was not terribly well received in the second round. And so, but on the other hand, going to the county, the county structure helped move things along a little bit, right? And so, a lot of it, I think, just comes down to that. And looking at holistically, and now that we're into the end of the year, going into the new year, something we've talked about a lot, and I have heard Seth talk about a lot, is if we do need to step in with trade aid, if the department needs to step in, how is that done in a way that doesn't influence plantings, given that we're coming into the spring cycle? And so that's something I know Seth has stressed on a lot. So you got a lot of really smart people working on these things. I think the biggest challenge at this point is how do the puzzle pieces fall into place. And on Capitol Hill in particular, right, with all the animosity, with a bunch of members saying we've delivered $60 billion, and with all the animosity that came with using reconciliation, are they going to find a way to get things done? They often find a way to get it done. And if not, USDA may have to find a way to get very creative if Congress can't act.
Can I add to Bart's point? So in 2019, when we did this, the MFP payments were county-based payments, and you had to plant the crop to be eligible to receive that payment. And at that point in time, we had historic prevent planting. So farmers were struggling with the decision of, do I put a crop in the ground to get this MFP payment, or do I take a prevent plant payment? And then I think we adjusted prevent plant and did a top-up on that. So not distorting market incentives is really important when you're delivering these programs.
So in the realm of things that would perhaps not be a good policy lever, or maybe you think it would be, but I think I mentioned to one of you, I'm kind of surprised I haven't heard someone raise their hand and say, well, we could idle another 20 million acres under a CRP, or we could do some things like that would make us less competitive. But is anybody hearing anything about that, or has that idea gone away in the current political environment?
I've heard it talked about, but I haven't heard anyone come out there and say, purposely, we're going to do this. I do remember the last time we did a big set-aside program in '83, we had a drought, and that solved all our problems immediately. So, you could probably make the argument, well, maybe that's what we should do and have a drought, and then we're all okay. But I don't think that's the direction we want to go.
Well, and so that proposal, there is a proposal out there. Folks are talking about it. But the last time I checked, I highly doubt Brazil's going to respond by saying, hey, us too. we'll just pull back as well, right? No, they're going to do the opposite and take advantage, right? And so, yeah, I would not put myself in the camp of thinking that it's going to be a good way out of this problem, particularly when you look at the U.S. Versus Brazil, pretty much on every front right now. Yet just another example of where we're falling behind and us deciding to idle acreage while they take advantage of it. I don't see being a great way out of the predicament we're in now.
Steve, when we had Senator Marshall here, he talked about, first thing I'd be thinking about is let's do E15. Let's think about the ethanol, the credits. Let's make sure that we're sending out exports as protein products rather than just grains. That kind of all fits in with the Trump administration strategy about onshoring and making sure we're bringing more manufacturing back to the United States, processing back to the United States. How much uptick do you see if we could wave a magic wand and get to year-round E15 or 45Z that was implemented quicker than what we're seeing now?
Yeah, certainly that's been the push, is to get E15 into the gas pumps. I think the challenge, of course, of the E15 is, and in Iowa we know we can get E15 very easily. It's not a big deal there. But the challenge, of course, is to get all the players or stakeholders in that supply chain all in sync. So that means engine manufacturers, and you got to get the all the gas suppliers, all of the retailers in line. Let alone, the ethanol folks are online; they're ready to go. So I think it's not as easy as just waving the magic wand when E15 happens. It certainly would be supportive to corn, and in some of the work we've done, we would expect to see easily 50-cent increase in corn prices. Now, it depends on where you are and where that ethanol plant is, but you look across, and so for some of us old people, I remember in Iowa where you would see, a 30 to 40 cent spread between southeast Iowa and northwest Iowa, and now they're on par each other when you look at basis. And so it would certainly be a huge boom to the ethanol side to farmers to see those sorts of numbers there. But it is going to be challenging, I think, to get it all there. We have seen increase in soybean processing across the United States. That has certainly been a boom to local areas where that's happening. But at the same time, we've seen crushing margins come down. They're still positive for the crushers. They've come off very high levels. But we're also likely going to see some rationalization over the next several years as some of those older plants just are not as efficient as the new plants, and we see them close when we have a problem of what do we do with all the meal we have in place. We can export so much meal, and to your point, Brazil is going to be right there with us because they're increasing their crushing capacity. So we've got to find a home for that, and so that probably means you'll see some rationalization of that capacity here in the United States. So it is, all the domestic demand is important, and we have to remember that, and that also means a bit of a shift in our mindset, is that maybe the export market won't be quite as available to us as we would like. But we've also heard, when you look at what's happening, China has come to Brazil for almost everything, although they've came to Argentina in the last couple of days. We have seen prices in Brazil start to rise up, and so we know at some point U.S. prices will be low enough because there's just not that demand, and China, if they're nothing, they're pragmatic, they will come back to the U.S. because that's where the cheapest price is going to be.
Well, that leads us right into one of our top questions here is how low does it have to go in order for that to be a good deal for the Chinese? Any thoughts on that?
I nominate Seth.
Me too.
Or Newton.
The last time this happened, we got to nearly 1 billion bushels of soybeans in inventory. So a low price doesn't necessarily mean people are going to give it away.
We did a little work on that and saying if China would go, cut exports in half, we certainly go back to that sub $9 bean price. We get there. So, and I think we get down to that level, then the Chinese will start to be a little more interested. But I don't have all the math in front of me right now to figure out, well, if it's the tariff stays there and what that do. But, the Chinese, again, like they are pragmatic. There is a bit, the Chinese sometimes will throw you a bone just as to kind of entice you a little bit to come back to the table and talk. But we'll have to see how that all plays out. I think it's going to be a while before they come back to the table this time.
Yeah, and the last time we had this as well, too, we sold them beans, even though the tariffs would appear to be prohibitive. I don't know, does COFCO pay a tariff, or does it moving its money from one pocket to the other pocket? And so I'm with you. I don't know where this goes, and I don't know explicitly just looking at what's the metric ton discount to Brazil versus the tariff rate. Tells you everything you need to know. Fair?
No, I think that's fair. Yeah, it's part of the equation of the Chinese, but not the whole equation, absolutely.
The Soybean Association was in town in D.C. not too long ago, and I believe they had some members from China that were there, buyers from China, and I was told that they said, we want to buy your beans. 70% of our soybeans moved to China between November and April, but they said, we're being told we cannot buy your beans.
Well, that seems to be a part of the overall strategy, right? To create ultimate pressure on U.S. government officials in order to come to the table and have some discussions. And it doesn't sound like the early discussions, at least the recent ones with the Treasury Secretary, got much farther than TikTok. I think soybeans were mentioned once, I heard, but it didn't seem, I mean, if you're in the Chinese seat, you know that you've been stockpiling from Brazil, right? And can they go till the end of the year, do we think? And feasibly not have to buy anything from the U.S.?
I think they can. I think they've, like you said, they've stockpiled and they've made it pretty clear that they're not willing to buy beans from the U.S. right now. And I think, right, to put maximum pressure on from a negotiating point of view. But I think they're willing to play the long game versus the short-term game right now.
And the market dynamic is a little bit different than it was in 2018.
Yep.
You might talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. When you go back to 1819, Brazil was only producing a little over 100 million metric tons of soybeans at that point. Well, now they're producing upward 177 million metric tons last year. So it's not a problem for them to be able to ship soybeans to China at the same time, be able to supply their domestic needs, which are growing as well. Let's acknowledge that. But the fact is that they can do that. The challenge Brazil has, and this is where we saw China come back to Brazil, or come back to the U.S. this year, was Brazil couldn't get it out the door fast enough. And vessel wait times in Santos and were 30 and 45 days, and buyers are like, I can't wait, I need to get them now. And so that we saw some sales come back to the U.S. because of that. So that's the big advantage the U.S. has is a logistics issue, be able to move stuff out the door fast versus what Brazil can do.
Thanks.
On that note, though, we're not moving any rail cars out west. So if China comes back and you got to turn on that whole rail infrastructure, get those workers back, that's not going to happen overnight.
No, but you're right. And the rail system is a problem that we have to deal with.
And potentially anything that wants to move south or west, right? If we don't have enough water in the Mississippi. Seth, one of the questions that's come in is, and I realize this is hypothetical because we don't know for sure there will be a government shutdown, although we've heard from elected officials here during the Outlook Forum that there likely will be one, at least for a short term. What happens to any USDA reports during that time that the government might be shut down and OMB is now saying we really don't want anybody but extremely critical employees even in agencies?
Well, I'll just say I've submitted a couple different plans on a way forward. I submitted a couple different plans on a way forward, and I'll just say that historically, the last time we had an extended shutdown over which a WASDE was to be published, I was the only one and this will tell you, I was the only one at the World Board who was essential. And I consider myself to be the least essential among the folks at the World Board, and so we didn't publish a WASDE report. Now, I've submitted a couple different plan options, and I've made my case for each of them. They'll come back and they'll tell me what I can do legally and what I should do, what they want me to do. But historically, we have not published during shutdowns where a WASDE report was in play.
Can I jump in here for a second, Sarah? So and most of the shutdowns that I've been through were on, from the Capitol Hill lens. But if you're on the outside looking in, shutdowns are, you'd think they'd be this very transactional thing. They're extraordinarily political, right? And you heard the senator talking about it this morning, kind of the Republican perspective on it. And keeping the government open. I remember on the Hill during the Obama administration, I mean, they were up putting barriers around the Washington Monument. if they thought they were going to try to prevent us from looking at it, but you couldn't walk up to it and approach it, right? Because it's shut down, right? And so there's a whole lot of different perspectives on shutdowns, right? Is it, to inflict pain, political pain, so that someone pays the price for shutting the government down? But they're just these extraordinarily political things, to the point that if you go back to that announcement yesterday that was put out, it's not just a matter of of employees that are essential. It's, the OMB announcement was a step further. It is sort of, if you are not deemed essential, you might not be coming back when it opens back up, right? And so we're in this negotiating phase right now. And the fact of the matter is the departments have quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how they implement these things. And a lot of those essential functions, I mean, eventually it can really become painful and start causing major problems, but a lot of the programs, there are ways to keep these things going. For keeping escrow accounts open, for example, for the risk management agency, so they can keep crop insurance indemnities flowing, those sorts of things, right? And so, but it's hard to disentangle that from all of the politics of the shutdowns.
So we've talked a lot about crop things primarily, but we do have another panel coming up after the break on New World screwworm and other animal health threats. One of our questioners wants to know about the economic impact if we did see a major infestation in the United States. Of course, nobody wants that, but if in fact those critters that are 70 miles south of our border right now happen to escape a little farther north and get into the U.S. cattle herd, thoughts on economic impact of that kind of infestation?
You want me to jump in?
You can jump in.
And I don't have the numbers off the top of, I mean, we just published another article this morning on the topic, and I still don't have them on the top of my head, in part because most of them I think are very loose estimates, right? I think the thing to keep in mind, if you compare what we did with the high path strategy back in the spring, much different disease than screwworm, right? I mean, we're not talking about this fly invasion that comes across the border and kills everything. It can kill things, right? But a lot of the cost comes in terms of you as a grower reacting to it and changing your management practices, and do you stop dehorning or whatever? Does it change kind of your birthing cycle, so on and so forth? And so I suspect what happens is that you have a pretty significant immediate market response potentially to the news that sort of then stabilizes somewhat quickly, and then it takes, so I mean, there's a lot of these huge, sort of estimates that I kind of take with a grain of salt, in part too because, I mean, right now, the one fly that they've caught 70 miles south of the border, prior to that it was 400 miles south of the border, but it's one, right? And so we're not talking about, there's 10 billion flies sitting on the Mexican border just waiting to get through, right? So, but to that point too, I mean, I think, not to keep comparing to high path, like if you take high path and the strategy that was rolled out in February, if you take the high water, that strategy was released on February 26th, right? That was the high water mark for wholesale egg prices. On the side here with screwworm, I think we have to be very careful, in part because cattle markets are fundamentally different than egg markets, which I think was very important. The Secretary made the comments that she made this morning, because there's been lots of speculation about that. But it's just fundamentally different, and by, across the board, the industry request has been to build a domestic production facility, which was announced with Governor Abbott back in the middle of August. And so sort of flooding the zone there, I think the border closure is sort of a prophylactic that is, I mean, to my knowledge, the border was wide open in the 50s and 60s when we were trying to combat this thing. Cattle were flowing back and forth, right? But to prevent movement, we're going, the department has gone over and above. And so I'll stop there. Seth, anything?
No, I think you absolutely have it right. And I'll just add a couple things here, which is, if it's present, it's harder to get rid of it than it is to try and push it back from where it's at. And two, you're trying to incentivize the rebuild, not through a payment, we talked about that, but you're trying to incentivize the rebuilding of the herd. Why would you, if you increase management costs and increase the monitoring and increase the costs and you isolate animals, that's going to be harder for folks to make a decision in the short run that they'd like to rebuild the herd. So I think that's an additional factor.
So I want to wrap up here and have John and Bart address more of the politics of what we're experiencing right now because of your experience on the committees And Steve, you're welcome to pitch in here as well. But thinking back to times when we've had some tough periods in the ag economy, and seeing sometimes, I can remember when Blanche Lincoln was chairman of the Senate Ag Committee, and your former boss that got elected after that. We can also remember when, Bart, you're working on what became the 2014 Farm Bill, having a Farm Bill now rally outside of the Capitol and hardly anybody showed up. I mean, there's different times where you see folks get very, very energized about change. And it kind of seems like right now there is a political element into maybe not turning against President Trump, but being more demanding of some action. So if there's no action either on some of the policy levers that we talked about, like ethanol, like another MFP or something, what do you see as potential implications for the midterms and going forward?
You want me to go first?
You're not doing this to me again.
Okay, I'll go first. I'll go first and somehow not get on my soapbox here, but the process behind farm policy and farm bills in general, I mean, it's something I spend a lot of time focused on, and in part because it's so unique to agriculture. If you look at the sum total of the federal government, about 22% of the U.S. budget is discretionary, right? That's the appropriators, where they're deciding things annually. Roughly half of that is defense spending. And so, we spend a lot of time scrutinizing those things. The appropriators go through their process, right? Although that also typically gets thrown into a year-end bill, right? But at least it gets a focus annually, right? The debt, Senator Marshall talked about how much we're spending on debt, roughly $15 trillion over the next 10 years is the baseline estimate for debt. That's essentially on autopilot. The roughly 75, or two-thirds of the budget is on mandatory spending. Most of that is also on autopilot, never gets revisited. What does get revisited? Farm bill every 5 years, and we all fly to Washington, rah, 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 we've got to get a farm bill done. The rest of the government doesn't work that way. And we do it because it's, things need sunlight, and so we subject it to this process of amendment in the floor where you get all sorts of crazy amendments. And then you get to the 14 Farm Bill that takes 3 years. You get to this Farm Bill, right? Everybody enjoying the 2023 Farm Bill? Well, how about the 24? Maybe the 25. They're just incredibly hard to get done, which is why they sidestepped it and went with OB3 through the reconciliation process. So the entirety of the government is moving to this supplemental reconciliation type approach where we don't do standalone stuff. We do everything at the end of the year in a big bill. Terrible way to run a country, right? It just continues to ramp up debt. But in terms of ag, we've tried to be the model for this process for years. And what has happened? If you look at real spending on the farm safety net, so budget function, to really nerd out, budget function 351, income stabilization, in inflation adjusted terms, everybody thinks, well, we're lavishing all sorts of subsidies on agriculture in a farm bill. In real terms, it has been declining for the last 30 years. We're asking farmers to do more and more with less and less, and it's not working. So what's happening? One, the process is moving us to supplementals, and what does that result in? $130 billion in ad hoc assistance that has now gone on for 8 years. Not a good model, right? But I would argue the alternative is we go back to the way we've always done it, trying to do farm bills, and it's just brutal for ag, and the amendment process is brutal. And so to some degree, I'm excited that ag has said enough of that. We're going to use the ways we can find to take care of folks, and it resulted in $60 billion additional dollars. And so for now, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, but heavens, I hope the country can find a way to figure out how to get back to some normalcy where we shine sunlight on everything on a regular process and tackle that $37 trillion that the senator was talking about this morning.
Well said.
Oh, come on.
Oh, gosh. This has been a really fun discussion. Steve, is there anything else you want to add here as we wrap up? And Seth, we've had a lot of different topics covered.
We've covered a lot. I go back to what John said. I'm still very optimistic about agriculture, and we get a lot of questions now from our agribusiness clients and for farmers to a little lesser extent about, well, how do we get people to invest in agriculture? They don't want to. And I always go back to them and I said, look, people still got to eat every single day. And that's not going to change in my lifetime. And I think there's still, like John, I'm still very optimistic about agriculture. We're going through a rough patch, and we go through these, and we somehow piece it together and figure it out, so I think we will when it's all said and done.
And Seth will be around to tell us when it's going to happen.
I think my last comment would just be, these are these smart people asking me questions is what keeps me employed as well, too, answering all these questions. So I'm just trying to, at USDA, provide as much information as I can when people address and deal with these kinds of issues these folks are talking about. And there's a lot of people asking a lot of really good questions, and we're just trying to be there to answer them so they can make the decisions that they think are good.
Well, we appreciate all of you for taking time and sharing your insights. So please join me in thanking all of them for this discussion.